The candles in the ballroom burned too bright, and Elena Hartley felt every one of them staring at her like 100 small suns. A hand closed around her wrist and pulled her forward, past silk gowns and polished shoes, toward the center of the marble floor where the music had just stopped, and the crowd had gone quiet with hunger for something to laugh at. "Dance," said Duke Nathaniel Ashworth, not as a request but as a command carved from ice. "Your father owed me a fortune he never paid. Tonight, you will pay a small piece of it with your body, since your family has nothing else left to give." A ripple of laughter moved through the guests like wind through dry grass. Elena's face burned, but she did not let her eyes fall to the floor. She had learned long ago that shame only grows heavier when you bow beneath it. "I am not a performer for your amusement, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady even as her heart slammed against her ribs. "No," Nathaniel answered, stepping back to join the ring of guests who now surrounded her like wolves circling something wounded. "Tonight, you are exactly that." Elena looked around the ballroom. She saw powdered faces behind fans, hiding smirks. She saw young lords leaning toward each other, already composing the story they would tell tomorrow. She saw Lady Margaret Ashworth standing near the fireplace, arms crossed, satisfaction gleaming in her narrow eyes. And near the servants' door, half hidden behind a velvet curtain, she saw Charlotte Bryce, her oldest friend, her face pale with worry. There was no way out. Refusing would mean the Duke could seize what remained of her father's estate that very night, throwing her and her younger brother into the street before winter came. Elena understood the trap perfectly. She had walked into it the moment she agreed to attend this ball, believing, foolishly, that the Duke wanted to discuss a payment plan like a reasonable man. She had been wrong. The musicians, seated on a raised platform at the edge of the room, waited for a signal. Nathaniel gave it with a small, cruel flick of his hand. A slow, mocking waltz began, the kind of tune usually reserved for children learning their first steps, not for a grown woman standing alone in front of 200 strangers. For one terrible second, Elena considered running. She pictured herself pushing through the crowd, out the tall doors, into the cold night air, away from every laughing eye in that room. But running would only prove them right. It would only confirm what they already believed, that she was nothing but a debtor's daughter, with no dignity left to protect. So instead, Elena closed her eyes. She thought of her mother. Before poverty had reshaped their lives, before her father's business had collapsed under bad decisions and worse luck, Elena's mother had once danced before kings. She had performed in grand courts across the continent, celebrated not as an object of ridicule but as an artist whose movements could silence a room with beauty rather than cruelty. She had taught Elena every step in secret, in the small back room of their house, humming songs long after the family's fortune had disappeared, insisting that grace was the one thing poverty could never steal. "They can take our home," her mother used to say, guiding Elena's arms through the air. "They can take our money and our name, but they cannot take how you carry yourself, unless you let them." Elena opened her eyes. She lifted her chin, and she began to move. At first, the guests laughed harder, expecting clumsy, frightened steps, expecting tears, expecting exactly the humiliation the Duke had promised them. But the laughter did not last. Elena's body remembered every lesson her mother had given her, every hour spent perfecting a turn, every breath timed to match the rhythm of a room. She did not dance like a frightened girl forced into a spectacle. She danced like a storm that had chosen, out of mercy, to be beautiful instead of destructive. The mocking waltz the musicians played suddenly seemed too small for what she was doing with it. Elena turned it into something else entirely, something that made the notes feel deliberate rather than childish, each step landing with precision that silenced whispers one by one. Lord Julian Reeve, standing near the refreshment table with a glass of wine forgotten in his hand, straightened as though someone had struck him gently on the back. He had come to this ball expecting nothing more than tedious conversation and overcooked mutton. He had not expected to watch a woman transform public cruelty into something that looked, impossibly, like triumph. Near the fireplace, Lady Margaret's satisfied smile began to falter. And Duke Nathaniel Ashworth, who had orchestrated this entire moment to remind a room full of debtors and rivals exactly what happened to those who crossed him, found himself unable to look away from the woman he had meant to break. Elena spun once, twice, her skirts catching the candlelight like water catching moonlight. She did not look at the guests. She did not look at the Duke. She looked somewhere past all of them, somewhere only she and her mother's memory could see. And in that private distance, she found a strength that made the entire ballroom feel suddenly uncomfortably small. The musicians, sensing something extraordinary happening in front of them, began to play with more feeling, matching her rhythm instead of mocking it. What had begun as an instrument of shame slowly became something closer to reverence. Charlotte, still hidden near the servant's door, pressed a hand over her mouth, tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness now but from something fiercer, something like pride. Elena's final turn brought her to a stop, precisely as the last note faded into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, somewhere near the back of the room, an elderly woman rose to her feet. Then another guest stood, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet, applauding a woman they had gathered to mock only minutes before. The sound of it filled the hall like thunder rolling through a clear sky, unexpected and impossible to ignore. Elena stood perfectly still at the center of it all, breathing hard, her pulse a wild drum beneath her skin. She had not expected this. She had expected humiliation, perhaps even tears she would have to hide until she reached the safety of her carriage. Instead, she stood in the eye of a storm of admiration she had not asked for, and did not fully understand. Duke Nathaniel Ashworth did not applaud. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable, something shifting behind his cold gray eyes that had not been there when the evening began. He had brought her into that ballroom to remind everyone present of his power. Instead, without meaning to, he had introduced them to something far more dangerous than debt or ruin. He had introduced them to a woman impossible to forget, and as the applause continued to rise around her, Elena understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold marble beneath her thin slippers, that whatever the Duke had planned for her tonight, it was no longer the story that would be told tomorrow. Something else had just begun, something neither of them could yet name, and neither of them could stop. Before the applause had fully faded, a footman stepped forward carrying a small silver tray, and on it sat a single folded letter bearing the Ashworth seal. Elena recognized the wax stamp instantly, the same seal that had arrived at her door 3 months earlier, informing her that her father's remaining debts had been transferred entirely into the Duke's hands after his sudden death. She had read that letter so many times the creases had worn thin, memorizing every cold, formal line as though understanding it better might soften what it demanded of her family. The footman did not hand the letter to her. Instead, he carried it directly to Nathaniel, who broke the seal without a word and read it in silence while 200 guests waited, still catching their breath from what they had just witnessed. Elena watched his jaw tighten as his eyes moved down the page, and for a moment, the triumphant hush of the ballroom curdled into something uncertain. "Is something wrong, Your Grace?" asked Lady Margaret, gliding closer, her earlier smile now replaced with sharp curiosity. Nathaniel folded the letter and slid it into his coat without answering her. His gaze returned to Elena, studying her the way a man studies an opponent, whose next move he can no longer predict. "You may return to the guests," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, stripped of the mockery that had filled it only minutes earlier. "This evening's entertainment has concluded." The words carried a strange weight, as though he were speaking to himself as much as to her. Elena curtsied not out of respect but out of habit, years of careful upbringing refusing to abandon her even now. As she turned to walk away, she caught Charlotte's eyes across the room, and her friend gave the smallest nod, a silent promise that they would speak the moment they were free of watching eyes. Elena moved through the crowd, and this time, no one stepped aside to mock her. Instead, guests parted with something closer to respect, murmuring compliments she barely heard over the pounding of her own heart. An older gentleman touched his hat toward her. A young woman in blue silk whispered to her companion that she had never seen anything so moving in her life. Elena kept walking, refusing to let her composure slip, though her hands trembled at her sides where no one could see them. She reached the edge of the ballroom, near tall windows overlooking the dark gardens, and allowed herself, finally, to breathe. Outside, the night was calm and cold, indifferent to everything that had just happened beneath the chandeliers. Elena pressed her palm against the cool glass, steadying herself, and caught her own reflection staring back, pale and flushed at once, eyes bright with something she could not quite name, relief perhaps, or fear of what would come next, now that the Duke had looked at her the way he had looked at her tonight. She did not know yet that Nathaniel Ashworth had spent every day since his father's death drowning quietly beneath debts of his own, debts hidden carefully behind titles and inherited land, debts that made tonight's cruel display less about punishing her family and more about proving to a room full of creditors that he still held power over someone. She did not know that the letter he had just read contained information about her father's original loan that did not match the numbers his own solicitors had presented to him for months. She only knew that something in his expression had changed, and that change frightened her more than his earlier cruelty ever had. Behind her, footsteps approached, unhurried but deliberate. She recognized the weight of them before she even turned. some instinct sharpened by fear telling her exactly who now stood close enough to speak without being overheard. "You dance beautifully," Nathaniel said quietly, standing just behind her shoulder, his reflection joining hers in the dark glass. "I did not expect that." "You did not intend for me to dance beautifully," Elena replied, refusing to face him. "You intended for me to be humiliated." For a long moment, he said nothing. The distant sound of conversation and music filled the silence between them, guests slowly returning to their evening, as though the last quarter hour had been nothing more than an unusually memorable performance. "Perhaps I did," Nathaniel admitted finally, his voice low. "But intentions rarely survive contact with reality, Miss Hartley. You should understand that better than anyone tonight." Elena finally turned to face him, refusing to let the tremor in her chest reach her voice. "Then perhaps, Your Grace, you should reconsider what you intend to do next, before it surprises you as much as this did." Something flickered across his face. Gone before she could name it. Whatever answer he might have given was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Margaret, who appeared beside them with the practiced smile of a woman who had heard every word and intended to use it. "Nathaniel," she said sweetly, though her eyes cut toward Elena like a blade wrapped in silk, "the Countess of Belmont is asking for you. Something about next month's arrangements." Nathaniel held Elena's gaze a moment longer before stepping back, the cold formality returning to his posture as easily as a mask sliding back into place. "We will speak again, Miss Hartley," he said, and though the words sounded almost like a warning, something beneath them trembled with a different meaning entirely, one Elena did not yet have the courage to examine. As he walked away with his aunt, Elena remained by the window, staring out into the dark garden where nothing moved and no one watched, grateful for even a few seconds of solitude before she had to face the rest of the evening. She did not yet understand that the letter in the Duke's coat pocket held a secret that would eventually unravel everything both of them believed to be true about her father's debt, about the Ashworth family's history, and about the fragile, dangerous thing that had just been born between them in front of 200 witnesses who would talk about it for weeks to come. She only knew, standing there with her heart still racing, that whatever had happened on that ballroom floor was far from finished. 3 days later, a carriage bearing the Ashworth crest stopped outside the small stone house Elena shared with her younger brother, and the sight of it sent a cold jolt of fear straight through her chest before the door had even opened. She had spent every hour since the ball waiting for exactly this moment, certain that whatever softness she had glimpsed in the Duke's eyes that night would prove to be nothing more than a passing curiosity, easily replaced by renewed cruelty once he remembered who she truly was to him, a debt with a face attached. Her brother, Thomas, only 12 years old and still too thin from months of careful rationing, peered through the window and turned to her with wide, frightened eyes. "Elena, is it him? Has he come to take the house?" "Stay inside," Elena told him, forcing calm into her voice she did not feel. "Whatever happens, stay inside and do not come out until I call for you." She smoothed her worn gray dress with trembling hands and stepped outside to meet whatever fate the carriage had brought her. But it was not Nathaniel who emerged from it. Instead, a woman in dark traveling clothes stepped down, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news quickly and without ceremony. "Miss Hartley," the woman said, "I am Agnes Whitfield, housekeeper to His Grace, Duke Ashworth. I have come with a message, and I would ask that you allow me a few minutes of your time." Elena hesitated only a moment before inviting her inside, though every instinct urged caution. The small parlor felt even smaller with a stranger from the Ashworth household standing inside it, taking in the threadbare furniture and patched curtains with an expression that held no judgment, only quiet understanding. "His Grace requests your presence at the estate tomorrow afternoon," Agnes said, once they were both seated. "He wishes to discuss the matter of your father's debt in greater detail." "Has he decided to seize the house after all?" Elena asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Or does he intend another performance for his guests first?" Something shifted in the older woman's face, something almost sympathetic. "I do not know his full intentions, Miss Hartley. I know only that he spent the 2 days following the ball locked in his study with his solicitor and a stack of old ledgers, and that he has not been in a temper to speak to since. Whatever changed in him that night, it was not nothing." Elena studied the housekeeper carefully, searching for some hidden motive behind the words, but found only tired honesty in her weathered face. "Why do you tell me this?" Agnes hesitated, glancing briefly toward the parlor window before answering. "Because I remember your mother, Miss Hartley. I served in this household long before His Grace inherited the title, back when your mother still danced in the great courts, before circumstances changed for her as they have now changed for you. She was kind to servants who others treated as invisible. I have not forgotten that kindness, even after all these years. The mention of her mother struck something deep and unguarded in Elena's chest, a wound she had learned to carry quietly but never fully healed. You knew her? I watched her dance once, at a gathering much like the one you attended 3 nights ago, Agnes said softly. The whole room fell silent, the same as it did for you. I believe that is why His Grace could not look away from you that night. Grief has strange ways of returning to us, Miss Hartley, wearing familiar faces we do not expect to see again. Elena sat in stunned silence, absorbing this fragment of history she had never known, a thread connecting her mother's forgotten glory to the very household that now held her family's future in its hands. She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what Agnes meant by grief and familiar faces, but the housekeeper rose before she could form the question, smoothing her skirts with brisk finality. Tomorrow afternoon, Miss Hartley, please do not be late. His Grace is not a patient man, though he has shown more patience toward you already than I have seen him show anyone in a very long time. After the carriage pulled away, Elena remained in the parlor for a long while, turning the strange conversation over in her mind, until Thomas crept out from the back room, his young face still pale with worry. What did she want? He asked. Are we losing the house? Not yet, Elena said, pulling him into a brief, reassuring embrace. I have been summoned to the estate tomorrow. I do not yet know what awaits me there. That night, sleep refused to come easily. Elena lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling above her narrow bed, replaying every second of the ballroom, the mocking waltz that had turned into something else entirely, the sudden change in Nathaniel's expression when he read that letter, the strange weight in his voice when he told her they would speak again. She thought of her mother dancing in this very household decades before disaster claimed their family's fortune, and wondered what other secrets connected their 2 families beneath the surface of debt and duty. The following afternoon, Elena arrived at Ashworth Manor dressed in her finest remaining gown, a pale blue dress that had once belonged to happier days, now carefully mended along its seams. A servant led her not to a grand receiving room filled with judgmental eyes, but to a private study lined with towering bookshelves and heavy velvet curtains that filtered the afternoon light into something soft and golden. Nathaniel stood near the window when she entered, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in a posture that reminded her uncomfortably of the man who had commanded her to dance 3 nights earlier. But when he turned, something in his face had softened, the sharp cruelty replaced by something more careful, almost uncertain. Thank you for coming, Miss Hartley, he said, gesturing toward a chair across from his desk. Please, sit. Elena remained standing. I would rather understand why I am here before I make myself comfortable in your home, Your Grace. A faint, almost reluctant smile touched the corner of his mouth. Very well. I will not waste your time with pleasantries you clearly do not trust. He moved to his desk and retrieved a leather folder, sliding it across the polished wood toward her. I have spent the last 3 days reviewing my father's original records regarding your father's loan. What I found does not match what my solicitors presented to me when I inherited this title. Elena opened the folder with unsteady hands, scanning columns of numbers and dates that meant little to her untrained eye, though the discrepancy in the final totals was impossible to miss even without expertise. This says my father's debt was nearly half of what your solicitors demanded from us. Yes, Nathaniel confirmed, watching her closely. It appears someone within my household has been inflating debts owed to the estate and quietly pocketing the difference for years, likely beginning under my father's declining health, before I ever inherited the title. Your family is not the only one affected, though yours appears to be among the largest discrepancies I have found so far. Elena looked up sharply, searching his face for deception, finding instead something that looked disturbingly like guilt. You forced me to dance in front of 200 guests over a debt you now tell me was never accurate. Yes, he said again, quieter this time, the single word carrying more weight than any lengthy apology could have managed, and I intend to correct that, though I understand no correction will undo what you endured that night. The silence between them stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Elena felt anger rising hot beneath her ribs, tangled together with something else she refused to name, something dangerously close to hope. Correcting the numbers on a ledger does not correct what you did in front of an entire ballroom, Your Grace. No, he agreed. It does not. But it is where I intend to begin. Outside the study window, clouds shifted across the afternoon sun, throwing shadows across the room that seemed to mirror the uncertainty settling between them. Neither of them yet understood that this quiet admission of wrongdoing was only the surface of a much deeper deception buried within the Ashworth household's finances, one that would eventually threaten not only Elena's family, but Nathaniel's own claim to the title he had inherited, and the fragile trust now beginning, however cautiously, to grow between two people who had every reason to remain enemies. Who would have done this? Elena asked, setting the folder down carefully on the edge of his desk, as though it might burn her fingers if she held it too long. Who benefits from inflating debts and hiding the truth from you? Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked older than his 30 years, weighed down by a burden he had clearly not expected to carry when he inherited his father's title. I have my suspicions, but no proof yet. My father's steward managed these accounts for nearly 2 decades before his death last winter. It is possible the corruption began and ended with him. It is also possible someone closer to me continued the practice after he was gone. Elena caught the careful way he avoided naming anyone directly, and understood, without needing to ask, that his suspicions extended somewhere uncomfortably close to his own family. She thought of Lady Margaret's satisfied smile in the ballroom, the sharp look she had given Elena by the window, and wondered how much the woman truly knew about the numbers hidden in these ledgers. "You believe your aunt is involved," Elena said quietly. It was not quite a question. Nathaniel did not answer immediately, his silence confirming more than any words could have. "I believe many things I cannot yet prove, Miss Hartley. Accusing a member of my own family without evidence would create chaos I am not prepared to unleash, particularly not while so many other debtors' futures depend on my ability to sort truth from theft within these records." "And what of my future in the meantime?" Elena pressed, unwilling to let sympathy for his difficult position soften the anger still burning beneath her composure. "Am I to simply trust that you will correct the debt eventually, while my brother and I continue living on the edge of losing everything?" "No," Nathaniel said firmly, meeting her eyes without hesitation this time. "I am canceling the remainder of your father's debt effective today, regardless of what further investigation reveals. Whatever the true amount owed, your family has more than paid it through what I put you through 3 nights ago. I will have the documents drawn up before you leave this house." Elena stared at him, momentarily speechless. She had walked into this study prepared for further cruelty, further humiliation dressed in polite language, and instead found herself facing an offer that could change her entire future, her brother's future, in the span of a single sentence. "Why would you do this? Guilt alone does not typically move men in your position to forgive fortunes, Your Grace." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Perhaps it is not only guilt, Miss Hartley. Perhaps I have spent 3 days unable to stop thinking about a woman who turned my cruelty into something the entire room could not look away from, and I find I would rather earn your regard honestly than continue extracting it through threats I now know were built on false numbers." The words hung between them, charged with a meaning neither of them seemed fully prepared to examine. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks, unsure whether it came from anger, embarrassment, or something far more dangerous stirring beneath both. "You speak as though you wish for my regard, Your Grace. Yet 3 nights ago you seemed content to destroy it entirely." "I was a fool 3 nights ago," he admitted, the honesty in his voice startling them both. "I was drowning in debts of my own, desperate to prove to a room full of creditors and rivals that I still held power over something, over someone. You were simply unfortunate enough to be within reach when I made that mistake." Elena studied him carefully, searching for the calculating cruelty she had witnessed in the ballroom, finding instead a man who seemed genuinely unsettled by his own actions, uncertain how to reconcile the person he had been that night with the person now standing before her, offering restitution he did not have to offer. It did not erase what he had done, but it complicated the simple hatred she had carried toward him since the moment his hand closed around her wrist beneath the ballroom candles. "I accept your offer regarding the debt," she said finally, choosing her words with care. "But do not mistake gratitude for forgiveness, Your Grace. What you did to me in front of your guests will not be so easily undone by paperwork, however generous." "I would not expect it to be," Nathaniel replied, something like respect flickering behind his gray eyes. "But I intend to try regardless." As Agnes Whitfield led her back through the manor's long corridors a short while later, documents finalizing the cancellation of her father's debt tucked safely into her bag, Elena allowed herself a single backward glance toward the study she had just left. Nathaniel stood again at the window, watching her go, his expression unreadable from this distance, though something about his posture seemed lighter than it had when she arrived. She did not yet know that Lady Margaret had been listening from the corridor outside the study for the better part of their conversation, her ear pressed close to the heavy door, her expression darkening with every word she overheard. Nor did Elena know that within the hour, Lady Margaret would send an urgent letter to a man in London whose name appeared nowhere in the ledgers Nathaniel had shown her, but whose fortune depended entirely on those numbers remaining hidden. Elena stepped out into the cool afternoon air, her father's debt finally lifted from her shoulders after months of crushing weight. and allowed herself, for the first time in a very long while, to imagine a future that did not begin and end with fear. She did not know how fragile that imagined future truly was, or how quickly the forces gathering quietly against her and against Nathaniel would move to destroy it, before it had any real chance to take root. A week later, a rumor arrived at Elena's door before any letter or visitor did, carried instead by the sharp tongues of the market women who gathered each morning near the bakery on the corner of her street. Charlotte found her there, standing frozen beside a basket of bread she had forgotten to pay for, listening to two women discuss the disgraced merchant's daughter who had apparently seduced the Duke into forgiving her family's debt, through means no respectable woman would ever admit to in public. "Do not listen to them," Charlotte said, pulling Elena away by the arm, though her own face had gone pale with fury on her friend's behalf. "They know nothing of what truly happened." "It does not matter what they know," Elena replied, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "It only matters what they believe, and what they choose to repeat to everyone who will listen." By that afternoon, the rumor had grown teeth. Elena heard it whispered outside the tailor's shop, saw it in the sideways glances of women she had known her entire life, felt it in the sudden coldness of neighbors who had once greeted her warmly. Someone had taken the story of her canceled debt and twisted it into something ugly, something that painted her not as a woman wronged and then compensated, but as a calculating opportunist who had traded her virtue for financial relief. She did not need Agnes Whitfield's warning delivered later that evening to know exactly where the poison had originated. Lady Margaret Ashworth had wasted no time turning private conversation into public scandal, using rumor as a weapon precise enough to damage Elena's reputation, without leaving a single fingerprint that could be traced back to her. "She has friends in every corner of society," Agnes explained quietly, having traveled once again to Elena's small home under the cover of dusk, unwilling to be seen delivering such warnings in daylight. "Word of your visit to the estate reached her within the hour. By evening, she had already begun speaking to certain ladies she trusts to spread such things quickly and thoroughly." "Does Nathaniel know?" Elena asked, unable to keep the sharp edge from her voice. "He suspects," Agnes admitted. "Though proving his own aunt orchestrated a public scandal against you will not be simple, particularly while he still lacks evidence connecting her to the missing funds in his father's old ledgers. She is careful, Miss Hartley. She has spent decades learning exactly how to damage someone without ever appearing to lift a finger." Elena sat with this knowledge long after Agnes departed, turning it over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by worry. She thought of the ballroom, the way the guests had risen to their feet in admiration only days before, and wondered how quickly that same admiration could curdle into judgment once whispered rumor replaced witnessed truth. Reputation, she realized bitterly, was a fragile and fickle thing, built slowly over years and destroyed within a single afternoon of careful gossip. 3 days later, an invitation arrived, embossed with gold lettering and the seal of Lord Julian Reeve, requesting Elena's presence at a modest garden gathering he intended to host the following week. Elena stared at the invitation for a long while before showing it to Charlotte, uncertain what to make of such unexpected attention from a man she had exchanged barely a dozen words with at the Ashworth ball. "He watched you dance that night," Charlotte said, reading over her shoulder with obvious delight. "Everyone saw it, Elena. He could not take his eyes off you the entire evening." "He does not know me," Elena said, though something in her chest fluttered uneasily at the memory of the kind, attentive way Julian had looked at her across the crowded ballroom, so unlike the calculating gaze Nathaniel had worn that same night. "An invitation to a garden party does not change that." "Perhaps not," Charlotte agreed, folding the invitation carefully and placing it back in Elena's hands. "But given the rumors currently circulating about you, an invitation from a respected, unmarried lord might be exactly the kind of public defense you need right now. If Lord Reeve stands beside you openly, Lady Margaret's whispers will carry far less weight." Elena considered this for a long moment, recognizing the practical wisdom in her friend's words even as something uncomfortable twisted in her stomach at the thought of using Julian's genuine interest as a shield against gossip. It felt dishonest, using a kind man's attention for protection rather than for the affection he seemed to offer so openly. And yet, she thought of Thomas, still too thin, still frightened by every carriage that stopped outside their home, and understood that she could no longer afford the luxury of pure intentions. She accepted the invitation. The garden party, held on the sprawling grounds of Lord Reeve's country estate, unfolded beneath a sky so clear and blue it seemed almost mocking against the tension coiled tightly in Elena's chest. She arrived in her best remaining gown, mended carefully by Charlotte's steady hands the night before, and found herself immediately surrounded by curious guests eager to study the woman at the center of the season's most talked-about scandal. Julian met her at the garden entrance himself, foregoing the formality of having a servant announce her arrival, his warm smile immediately easing some of the tension that had followed her all the way from home. "Miss Hartley," he said, offering his arm with easy confidence. "I confess I have thought of little else since the Ashworth ball. I am glad you accepted my invitation." "You are kind to extend it, Lord Reeve," Elena replied, allowing herself to relax slightly under his genuine warmth, so different from the careful, guarded conversations she had grown accustomed to sharing with Nathaniel, particularly given the rumors currently attached to my name. "I place no weight on rumors, Miss Hartley," Julian said firmly, guiding her along a stone path lined with blooming roses. "I place weight only on what I witnessed myself, a woman forced into humiliation, who transformed it into something extraordinary, through nothing but her own grace and courage. Anyone spreading cruel stories about you clearly was not paying proper attention that evening." Elena felt something loosen in her chest at his words, a knot of tension she had carried since the market women's whispers first reached her ears. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to simply enjoy a conversation, without calculating hidden motives or searching for concealed cruelty beneath polite words. They walked together through the gardens for the better part of an hour, Julian asking thoughtful questions about her mother's history as a dancer, listening with genuine interest rather than polite obligation, as Elena shared fragments of memories she rarely spoke of aloud. He told her of his own family's estate in the countryside, of his love for horses and his frustration with the rigid expectations society placed on unmarried lords of his standing. By the time they returned to the main gathering, something warm and comfortable had settled between them, entirely unlike the charged, uncertain tension that colored every interaction with Nathaniel. It was during this comfortable lull that Elena first noticed a carriage arriving late to the gathering, bearing a crest she recognized instantly. Nathaniel stepped down from it alone, his expression tightening the moment his gaze found Elena walking arm in arm with his host through the garden, laughing at something Julian had just said. "I did not realize the Duke had been invited," Elena murmured, watching Nathaniel's approach with a mixture of dread and something else she refused to examine too closely. "I invite him to most gatherings," Julian said easily, apparently unaware of the sudden tension radiating from Elena's posture. "Despite everything, he remains an old friend of my family. Come, let us greet him together." Elena had little choice but to follow, her arm still linked with Julian's, as Nathaniel approached with the measured, deliberate steps of a man forcing calm onto features that clearly wished to express something far less composed. "Ashworth," Julian greeted warmly, "I did not expect you to arrive so late." "Business detained me longer than expected," Nathaniel replied, though his eyes remained fixed on Elena, taking in the easy comfort visible in her posture beside his old friend. "Miss Hartley, I did not realize you and Reeve were acquainted." "We met at your ball, Your Grace," Elena said carefully, refusing to let his obvious displeasure unsettle her composure in front of the gathered guests. "Lord Reeve was kind enough to extend an invitation, given the circumstances currently surrounding my reputation." Something flickered across Nathaniel's face at the pointed reminder of his own role in creating those circumstances. Guilt and something sharper, something that looked uncomfortably close to jealousy, warring visibly behind his carefully controlled expression. "I see. I am glad to hear someone has taken proper care to defend your good name, Miss Hartley, given how thoroughly it has been attacked in recent days." "Attacked by whom, precisely?" Julian asked, oblivious to the layers of meaning passing between Elena and Nathaniel. "I have heard only vague whispers myself, nothing substantial enough to credit." "That is precisely the danger of such rumors," Nathaniel replied smoothly, though his eyes never left Elena's face. "They rarely require substance to cause damage." The conversation continued for several more minutes, polite on its surface, though Elena felt the tension crackling beneath every exchanged word, every careful glance Nathaniel directed her way when Julian's attention wandered elsewhere. By the time the Duke finally excused himself to greet other guests, Elena realized her hands had curled into tight fists at her sides, though she could not have said whether from anger, confusion, or something far more complicated stirring dangerously beneath both. "He seemed rather displeased," Julian observed once Nathaniel had moved out of earshot, genuine curiosity coloring his tone. "Is there history between you I should be aware of, Miss Hartley?" "Only the history you witnessed yourself at his ball," Elena replied carefully, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered how honest they truly were. "Nothing more than that, Lord Reeve." But as the garden party continued around her, laughter and conversation drifting pleasantly through the warm afternoon air, Elena found her gaze repeatedly drawn across the lawn to where Nathaniel stood speaking with other guests, his own attention returning to her again and again despite his obvious effort to appear otherwise engaged. Something dangerous had taken root between them in that ballroom a week ago. Something neither canceled debt nor polite garden conversation with another man seemed capable of fully extinguishing. She did not yet understand how complicated her situation was about to become, caught between a kind, genuine man offering exactly the safety and simplicity her circumstances demanded, and a complicated, guilt-ridden duke whose presence unsettled her in ways she was not yet prepared to name, even to herself. Later that evening, as the sun began sinking behind the tree line and servants moved quietly among the guests, lighting lanterns strung between the garden trees, Elena found herself briefly alone near a small stone fountain at the far edge of the property, having excused herself from Julian's company to gather her thoughts before the gathering concluded. The music from the main lawn drifted faintly on the evening breeze, and for a moment she allowed herself simply to breathe, to exist without the weight of rumor or debt or careful calculation pressing against her chest. She did not hear Nathaniel approach until he was already beside her, his tall figure silhouetted against the deepening orange sky. "You seem to be avoiding me, Miss Hartley," he said quietly, coming to stand near the fountain's edge, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cooling evening air. "I am attempting to enjoy a party I was fortunate enough to be invited to, Your Grace," Elena replied, though she made no move to walk away. "That does not require your presence at every moment." "No," he agreed, a faint, rueful smile touching his mouth. "Though I confess I have found myself watching for you regardless, throughout the entire afternoon." Elena turned to face him fully, searching his expression in the fading light. "Why does that trouble you so deeply, Your Grace? That I might find genuine kindness and comfortable company in someone other than yourself?" The question landed harder than she intended, and she watched something flicker across his face, something raw and unguarded, before he composed himself once more. "Perhaps because I know precisely what I owe you, and precisely how little I have done thus far to earn any place in your regard beyond mere obligation. Reeve offers you ease, Miss Hartley. I offer you complication and guilt, and a family determined to see you fail. I cannot fault you for choosing the simpler path." "I have not chosen anything," Elena said honestly, surprised by her own candor. "I am simply trying to survive the wreckage of rumor your aunt has left scattered across my reputation, while also trying to understand what, precisely, you want from me now that the debt between us has been settled." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the water rippling gently in the fountain between them. "I do not fully know myself, Miss Hartley. I only know that since the night of the ball, I have found it increasingly difficult to think of anything else, and that watching you walk through these gardens on Reeve's arm this afternoon caused a reaction in me I did not expect and did not particularly welcome." The confession hung in the cooling evening air between them, more honest than anything he had offered her before, more dangerous too, given everything that stood between them, the humiliation still fresh in her memory, the rumors his own family had likely orchestrated against her, the fundamental impossibility of a duke and a merchant's disgraced daughter finding any acceptable future together in the rigid society that governed both their lives. "You should not say such things to me, Your Grace," Elena said quietly, though she made no move to step away from him. "It serves neither of us well." "Probably not," he agreed, "and yet I find myself saying them regardless." Before either of them could venture further into such dangerous honesty, the sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path pulled them both back to caution, and Elena stepped back just as Charlotte appeared around the hedge, her expression carefully neutral though her eyes flickered curiously between Elena and the Duke standing close beside the fountain. "Elena, Lord Reeve is asking after you," Charlotte said. "The evening's entertainment is about to begin." "Of course," Elena replied, grateful for the interruption, even as some small, reckless part of her regretted it. She glanced once more at Nathaniel, finding his expression once again carefully composed, the vulnerability of moments before tucked safely away behind practiced formality. "Good evening, Your Grace." "Miss Hartley," he replied with a slight bow, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than propriety strictly required. As Elena walked back toward the lantern-lit lawn with Charlotte, her heart still racing from the strange, charged conversation beside the fountain, she understood with growing certainty that whatever complicated tangle of guilt and attraction had begun between herself and the Duke on the night of that terrible dance, it was not going to resolve itself quietly, regardless of how carefully both of them tried to keep it contained. 2 weeks passed in a fragile, uneasy calm. Elena's days settled into a new rhythm, one where the crushing fear of losing her home no longer haunted every waking hour. replaced instead by the quieter, more persistent worry of rumors that refused to fully fade despite Julian's continued public attention toward her. She saw him twice more during those weeks, once at a small dinner hosted by mutual acquaintances, and once during a pleasant afternoon ride through the countryside that left her cheeks flushed with something that felt, if not quite love, at least like the comfortable beginning of genuine affection. She did not see Nathaniel at all during those 2 weeks, though Agnes Whitfield continued her careful, discreet visits, delivering fragments of news from the Ashworth estate that Elena found herself waiting for with an eagerness she tried, unsuccessfully, to suppress. "He has dismissed 3 members of the household staff," Agnes reported during one such visit, settling into the same worn chair she had occupied during her first appearance at Elena's door. "All of them connected in some way to the late steward, all of them with access to the estate's financial records. He grows closer to the truth, Miss Hartley, though it appears to be costing him a great deal of peace in the process." "Has he found proof against his aunt?" Elena asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice, though she told herself it was concern for the truth alone, nothing more personal than that. "Not yet," Agnes admitted. "Lady Margaret is far too careful to leave evidence easily traced back to her own hand. But His Grace grows more convinced daily that she sits at the center of whatever corruption has drained this estate's finances for years. It is a dangerous suspicion to hold against family, Miss Hartley, particularly family as skilled at manipulation as Lady Margaret has proven herself to be." Elena absorbed this news with a growing sense of unease she could not fully explain, some instinct warning her that whatever quiet investigation Nathaniel pursued behind the walls of his estate, it would not remain contained there indefinitely. She thought of Lady Margaret's sharp, calculating eyes at the ballroom, the satisfaction that had flickered across her face when she believed her scheme to humiliate Elena had succeeded completely, and understood, with a chill that settled deep in her chest, that a woman capable of such careful cruelty would not surrender her secrets easily, nor would she forgive whoever threatened to expose them. The summons arrived 3 days later, delivered not by Agnes this time, but by a formal letter bearing the Ashworth seal, requesting Elena's presence at the estate that same afternoon regarding, the letter stated vaguely, a matter of considerable urgency concerning her late father's original loan documents. Elena read the brief message twice, searching for any hint of what awaited her, finding only careful, formal language that revealed nothing beyond the request itself. She arrived at Ashworth Manor, with Charlotte accompanying her this time, her friend's presence offering a small measure of comfort against whatever difficult conversation lay ahead. A servant led them both to the same private study where Elena had first learned of her father's forgiven debt, though this time, Nathaniel was not alone. Lady Margaret stood beside the window, her expression composed into practiced pleasantness that did not quite reach her eyes, while a third figure, an older man Elena did not recognize, sat stiffly in a chair near the desk, a leather case resting on his lap. "Miss Hartley," Nathaniel greeted her, his voice carefully neutral, though something tense radiated from his posture, a coiled readiness that suggested whatever conversation was about to unfold, he expected it to be difficult. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. This is Mr. Whitmore, a solicitor engaged to review the original documentation surrounding your father's business dealings with this estate." Elena's stomach tightened with sudden apprehension. "I was told the matter concerning my father's debt had already been resolved, Your Grace." "It had been," Lady Margaret interjected smoothly before Nathaniel could respond, moving away from the window with deliberate grace. "Until certain new information came to light, suggesting the original discrepancy in the ledgers was not, in fact, the result of theft or corruption within this household, but rather a deliberate fraud perpetrated by your own father, Miss Hartley, in the final years before his death." The accusation struck Elena like a physical blow, and she felt the color drain from her face even as anger surged hot beneath her shock. "That is a lie. My father was many things, but he was not a thief." "Mr. Whitmore has reviewed correspondence suggesting otherwise," Lady Margaret continued, her voice maintaining its infuriating calm politeness, even as she delivered accusations designed to destroy what remained of Elena's family reputation. "It appears your father may have falsified certain records regarding his business partnership with this estate, inflating projected profits to secure a larger loan than his actual holdings could support, then quietly diverting funds elsewhere before his unfortunate death left the debt unpaid." Elena turned sharply to Nathaniel, searching his face for reassurance, for the same certainty he had shown weeks earlier when he insisted the discrepancy in the ledgers pointed toward theft within his own household. Instead, she found something far more troubling: uncertainty, doubt flickering behind his gray eyes as he glanced toward the solicitor's leather case. "Is this true?" Elena demanded, her voice shaking now despite her effort to maintain composure. Your Grace, weeks ago you told me yourself that someone within your household had inflated these numbers. Has that conclusion changed so quickly? Mr. Whitmore's findings raised new questions I had not previously considered, Nathaniel said carefully, though he would not fully meet her eyes as he spoke, and Elena felt something cold settle in her chest at his hesitation. I do not yet know the full truth of the matter, Miss Hartley. That is precisely why I asked you here, to review the documentation together and determine what actually occurred. Charlotte's hand found Elena's, gripping tightly in silent support, as the solicitor opened his leather case and began laying out documents across the desk, pages filled with figures and correspondence Elena did not recognize, dates and signatures that meant nothing to her. Without careful, patient study she had no time to conduct under the weight of everyone's expectant stares. These letters, Mr. Whitmore said, indicating several pages near the top of the stack, appear to be correspondence between your father and a business associate in London, discussing plans to secure additional funding from the Ashworth estate, under false pretenses, regarding the true state of his failing enterprises. Elena's hands trembled as she picked up the letters, scanning the handwriting with growing dread. It did resemble her father's careful script, the particular slant of his letters, the way he formed his capital initials with an old-fashioned flourish she remembered from childhood correspondence. But something about the content felt wrong, foreign, unlike the careful, honest man she remembered, even in the difficult final years before his business collapsed entirely. This is not my father's handwriting, Elena said finally, though uncertainty crept into her own voice even as she spoke the words, doubt planted deliberately by the careful presentation of evidence designed to seem irrefutable. Or if it is, these words were never truly his. Forgery is easily claimed and difficult to disprove, Miss Hartley, Lady Margaret said smoothly, though something satisfied glinted behind her carefully composed expression, something that made Elena's suspicion sharpen into something closer to certainty, particularly by a daughter desperate to protect her father's memory and her own claim to forgiven debt. Elena looked up sharply, finally understanding the true purpose behind this carefully orchestrated confrontation. This was not genuine investigation into the truth of her father's dealings. This was Lady Margaret's counterattack, a calculated attempt to discredit Elena entirely, to reverse the forgiveness of debt Nathaniel had granted weeks earlier, and in doing so, to protect whatever secrets truly lay buried within the Ashworth estate's corrupted finances. Your Grace, Elena said, turning to Nathaniel with desperate urgency, searching his face for the certainty she needed to see there. You cannot possibly believe these documents are genuine. You yourself uncovered evidence of theft within your own household weeks ago. Has that evidence simply vanished because your aunt now presents a convenient alternative explanation? Nathaniel's expression remained troubled, caught visibly between competing loyalties, family obligation warring against whatever growing trust had developed between himself and Elena over these past weeks. I do not know what to believe yet, Miss Hartley. I intend to have both sets of documentation independently verified before reaching any final conclusion. It was not the full-throated defense Elena had desperately hoped for, and the gap between what she needed from him and what he was willing to offer in front of his aunt's watchful presence cut deeper than she expected. She felt Charlotte's grip tighten further around her hand, a silent warning against saying anything further that might damage her position beyond repair. Then I suggest you conduct that verification quickly, Your Grace, Elena said, forcing steel into her voice despite the tremor threatening to betray her composure entirely. Because I will not stand quietly by while my father's memory is destroyed to protect whoever truly stole from this estate. She left the study without waiting for a response, Charlotte hurrying to keep pace beside her, both of them moving swiftly through the manor's long corridors toward the safety of open air and distance from the calculating satisfaction still visible on Lady Margaret's composed face. Neither of them noticed Agnes Whitfield watching from a side passage, her expression grave with worry, already calculating how quickly she could deliver a warning to the one person who might still uncover the truth, before Lady Margaret's carefully constructed lies became impossible to unravel. Elena did not return home immediately. Instead, she asked Charlotte to walk with her along the quiet lane bordering the eastern edge of the Ashworth property, needing the movement, the fresh air, anything to loosen the tight knot of fury and fear coiled around her chest. The late afternoon sun slanted low through the trees, casting long shadows across the path, and for a while neither woman spoke, both absorbing the weight of what had just occurred within that study. He did not defend you, Charlotte finally said, breaking the silence. Not truly, not the way he should have. He is caught between us, Elena replied, though she heard the hollow uncertainty in her own justification, even as she offered it. His aunt has raised him since childhood, from what Agnes has told me. Family loyalty does not dissolve overnight simply because a stranger's word contradicts it. You are not merely a stranger to him, Charlotte said pointedly. Not after everything that has happened between you these past weeks. If he cannot stand firmly beside you now, when it matters most, I fear what that says about how firmly he will stand beside you should matters grow more difficult still. Elena had no answer for that, because some quiet, honest part of her feared the very same thing. She thought of Julian then, of his easy, uncomplicated warmth, his willingness to defend her publicly without hesitation or doubt, and wondered whether Charlotte's earlier suggestion, that she seek safety in his steady affection, rather than Nathaniel's complicated, guilt-tangled attention, had been wiser counsel than she originally credited it. They had nearly reached the end of the lane when the sound of hurried footsteps behind them made both women turn. Agnes Whitfield approached at a pace unusual for the normally composed housekeeper, her breath coming quick, her expression tight with urgency. "Miss Hartley," she said, once she had closed the distance between them, "I must speak with you before you return home. What I overheard in that study concerns me greatly, and I do not believe His Grace fully understands the danger currently surrounding him." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, alarm sharpening her attention immediately. Agnes glanced back toward the manor, as though worried someone might be watching even from this distance, before continuing in a lowered voice. "The solicitor, Mr. Whitmore, did not arrive at Lady Margaret's request alone. I recognized his name from correspondence I glimpsed weeks ago, tucked among papers Lady Margaret believed she had disposed of properly. He has business connections to a merchant in London, a man who has, on more than one occasion, provided Lady Margaret with funds that never appear in the estate's official records." Elena's pulse quickened. "You believe this solicitor is working with her, deliberately fabricating evidence against my father to protect her own theft?" "I believe it strongly, though I cannot yet prove it," Agnes confirmed. "Lady Margaret is clever, Miss Hartley. She has likely anticipated that His Grace's suspicion would eventually turn toward her, and has moved quickly to redirect that suspicion elsewhere before he can gather sufficient proof against her directly. Accusing your late father, a man no longer alive to defend himself, was a calculated choice. Dead men cannot contradict forged letters." The implication settled heavily over Elena as they continued walking, Charlotte and Agnes flanking her on either side like quiet guardians against a danger that felt, suddenly, far larger and more organized than she had initially understood. This was not simply cruelty born of wounded pride, the kind of petty vindictiveness she had assumed motivated Lady Margaret's earlier scheming. This was a carefully constructed defense, built to protect years of accumulated theft by sacrificing whatever reputation remained of a dead man and his grieving daughter. "I must find proof," Elena said finally, her voice hardening with determination even as fear continued churning beneath it. "If Nathaniel will not defend my father's memory without evidence, then I will find that evidence myself." "That is dangerous, Miss Hartley," Agnes warned. "Lady Margaret has resources and connections far beyond what you currently possess. Should she discover you investigating her directly, she will not hesitate to use every advantage available to silence you entirely, whether through further scandal or through means considerably less gentle than rumor. I have already lost nearly everything once to this family's carelessness with the truth," Elena replied, her jaw set with quiet resolve. "I will not stand quietly by while my father's name is destroyed, to protect a thief, simply because confronting her directly frightens me. Will you help me, Mrs. Whitfield? You clearly know this household and its secrets better than anyone else willing to speak honestly with me." Agnes hesitated only a moment before nodding, something resolute settling into her weathered features. "I will help however I can, Miss Hartley. Your mother showed kindness to this household when few others bothered to notice servants at all. I owe her memory, and you, at least this much loyalty in return." As the three women parted ways near the edge of the property, Elena's earlier despair had transformed into something sharper, something closer to purpose. Whatever uncertainty Nathaniel had shown within that study, whatever complicated loyalty still bound him to his manipulative aunt, Elena understood now that she could not afford to wait passively for him to choose sides. If the truth was going to emerge before Lady Margaret's fabricated evidence destroyed her father's memory entirely, Elena would have to help uncover it herself, regardless of the danger such investigation might invite into her already precarious life. The following days blurred into careful, quiet work. Agnes smuggled fragments of old household correspondence out of the estate whenever opportunity allowed, meeting Elena in the back room of the bakery Charlotte's cousin owned, where 3 women huddled over stolen papers and whispered theories long after the shop had closed for the evening. Piece by piece, a pattern began emerging from the scattered documents. Letters between Lady Margaret and the London merchant Agnes had mentioned, careful references to shipments and investments that never appeared anywhere in the estate's official ledgers. "She has been funneling money out of the estate for years," Elena said one evening, studying a particularly damning letter by candlelight, her eyes tired but sharp with growing certainty. "Disguised as investments in a shipping venture that, as far as I can tell, does not actually exist." "The merchant's name appears repeatedly," Charlotte added, pointing to a signature at the bottom of several letters. "Mr. Aldous Pierce. If we could find him, perhaps convince him to testify against Lady Margaret in exchange for leniency regarding his own involvement, we might finally have proof substantial enough to clear your father's name entirely." "That assumes he would be willing to betray a woman who has clearly paid him well for his silence and cooperation," Agnes cautioned. "Men like Mr. Pierce rarely abandon profitable arrangements without significant incentive." Elena considered this, turning the problem over carefully in her exhausted mind. "Then perhaps we do not need his cooperation. Perhaps we simply need enough evidence connecting Lady Margaret's private correspondence to the fraudulent letters presented as my father's. Evidence a solicitor with genuine integrity could examine and confirm as forgery." It was Charlotte who eventually suggested the solution, remembering a distant family friend who worked as a handwriting expert for the courts in London, a man known for his meticulous, impartial analysis of disputed documents. Securing his services would require money Elena did not currently possess, but Agnes, after some hesitation, offered to advance the necessary funds from her own modest savings, trusting that justice, once achieved, would eventually allow repayment. The letter requesting the expert's assistance was dispatched within days, along with careful copies of both the fraudulent letters presented in Nathaniel's study and samples of Lady Margaret's known handwriting, secured discreetly by Agnes from old household correspondence she had access to as housekeeper. All that remained was waiting, an agonizing stretch of days during which Elena felt the weight of her father's endangered reputation pressing more heavily against her chest with each passing hour. During this tense waiting period, Nathaniel sent word twice requesting to see her. Both messages returned unanswered. Elena was not yet ready to face him, not while uncertainty still colored his loyalty, not until she possessed proof strong enough to force him to choose clearly between his aunt's lies and the truth Elena was determined to uncover. Julian, meanwhile, continued his gentle, persistent courtship, unaware of the dangerous investigation consuming Elena's private hours, offering instead comfortable distraction whenever she allowed herself brief respite from worry. It was during one such distraction, a quiet afternoon walk through the public gardens with Julian, that Elena first noticed she was being followed. The man kept careful distance, blending into the crowds of afternoon strollers with practiced skill, but Elena's instincts, sharpened by weeks of careful, secretive investigation, caught the way his attention lingered too long on her and Julian, the way he paused whenever they paused, resumed walking whenever they resumed. "Do not look now," she murmured to Julian, keeping her voice light despite the alarm racing beneath her calm exterior. "But I believe we are being watched." Julian, to his credit, did not startle or turn conspicuously, instead guiding her smoothly toward a nearby bench where they could observe their surroundings without drawing obvious attention. "The man in the gray coat near the fountain?" "Yes," Elena confirmed, her heart pounding. "He has been following at the same distance since we left the bookshop nearly 20 minutes ago." "Perhaps he is simply enjoying the same pleasant afternoon we are," Julian suggested, though his tone carried more concern than his words admitted. "Or perhaps you should tell me plainly, Miss Hartley, what precisely you have been occupying yourself with these past weeks that might attract such careful attention from a stranger." Elena hesitated, weighing how much to reveal, aware that involving Julian more deeply in her dangerous investigation carried its own risks, both to his reputation and potentially to his safety. But something about his steady, patient gaze convinced her that honesty, at least partial honesty, would serve her better than continued secrecy. "I have been gathering evidence," she admitted quietly, "proving that Lady Margaret Ashworth has stolen substantial funds from her nephew's estate for years, and fabricated letters implicating my late father in fraud to protect herself from discovery." Julian's expression sharpened with genuine alarm. "Elena, that is exceedingly dangerous ground to walk alone. Lady Margaret's reputation for ruthlessness is well known throughout society, even among those who have never personally crossed her." "I am aware," Elena replied, though her voice remained steady despite the fear coiling tighter in her chest with every glance she stole toward the man still lingering near the fountain. But I cannot allow my father's memory to be destroyed simply because confronting the truth frightens me, Lord Reeve. Some things matter more than personal safety. Julian studied her for a long moment, something complicated shifting behind his warm brown eyes, admiration tangled together with genuine worry. Then let me help you. Properly this time. Rather than simply offering pleasant distraction from your troubles. I have connections within London society that might prove useful, and resources at my disposal that could accelerate whatever investigation you currently pursue. Elena felt gratitude wash through her, tempered by the uncomfortable awareness that accepting his help meant deepening a connection she had not fully decided how to navigate, particularly given the unresolved tangle of feeling that still bound her, however reluctantly, to Nathaniel despite his failure to defend her clearly in his study. But pragmatism won over hesitation, and she nodded her agreement, grateful for any ally willing to stand openly beside her against the danger now clearly circling closer. They left the gardens together shortly afterward, the man in the gray coat abandoning his pursuit once they entered a crowded carriage stand, though Elena suspected strongly that Lady Margaret would soon receive a full report of her afternoon activities regardless of how carefully she and Julian had attempted to disguise their conversation from prying eyes. That evening, a different visitor arrived at Elena's door, one she had not expected and was considerably less prepared to face than the friendly warning she had received from Agnes weeks earlier. Nathaniel stood on her doorstep as darkness settled fully over the quiet street, his expression a complicated mixture of frustration and barely concealed worry. "You have refused to see me for over a week, Miss Hartley," he said, without preamble, once she had reluctantly invited him inside, mindful of curious neighbors who might notice a Duke's carriage lingering too long outside her modest home. "I have grown increasingly concerned that my aunt's accusations against your father have driven a wedge between us that cannot be repaired." "Your silence in that study drove the wedge, Your Grace," Elena replied honestly, refusing to soften the truth simply to spare his feelings. "Not my absence since. I needed time to determine whether I could trust you to eventually choose truth over family loyalty, given how clearly you hesitated when it mattered most." Nathaniel absorbed this with visible difficulty, guilt evident in the tight set of his jaw. "I have spent every day since that meeting investigating the documents Mr. Whitmore presented, Miss Hartley. I did not simply accept my aunt's version of events and abandon the matter entirely, whatever impression my hesitation that afternoon may have given you." "And what have you discovered?" Elena asked, cautious hope threading through her wariness despite her best effort to remain guarded. "Enough to grow deeply suspicious of Mr. Whitmore's credentials and connections," Nathaniel admitted. "Enough to suspect my aunt orchestrated that entire confrontation with considerably more calculation than genuine concern for accurate financial records. I have engaged an independent solicitor of my own to review everything presented that day, separate entirely from anyone connected to my aunt or her associates." Relief flooded through Elena, sharp and immediate, though she tempered it carefully against the awareness that suspicion alone would not be sufficient to clear her father's name, not against evidence her own private investigation had not yet fully assembled into proof strong enough to withstand challenge. "I have been conducting my own investigation as well, Your Grace, with Mrs. Whitfield's assistance. We believe we have identified the true source of the missing funds, and evidence suggesting the letters presented as my father's correspondence were, in fact, forged." Nathaniel's expression sharpened with immediate, focused attention. "Show me." Together, over the following hour, Elena walked him through everything she and Agnes and Charlotte had carefully assembled, the letters connecting Lady Margaret to the fictional shipping venture, the pattern of funds disappearing from the estate's accounts precisely when Lady Margaret's known expenses had increased, the growing certainty that Mr. Whitmore's presented evidence had been fabricated specifically to redirect blame away from the true thief and toward a dead man incapable of defending his own reputation. By the time Nathaniel finally left her small home late that evening, something had shifted decisively between them. The careful distance of the past week collapsed entirely beneath shared purpose and mutual, if still fragile, trust. He paused at the door, turning back to face her one final time before stepping out into the darkness. "Whatever happens next, Miss Hartley," he said quietly, "know that I intend to see the truth exposed fully, regardless of what it costs my family's reputation, or my own comfort within it. Your father's memory deserves that much, and so I have come to believe, do you." Elena watched his carriage disappear into the darkness long after he had gone, her heart a tangled, uncertain thing, torn between wariness earned through hard experience and something warmer, something dangerously close to hope, that perhaps this complicated, guilt-burdened Duke might yet prove himself worthy of the trust she had been so reluctant to extend him. 3 days later, the response from the handwriting expert in London finally arrived, and Elena tore the seal open with trembling fingers the moment Charlotte delivered it to her door. The letter was thorough, precise, written in the careful, clinical language of a man accustomed to testifying before courts of law, and its conclusion was unambiguous. The letters presented as correspondence from Elena's father bore only superficial resemblance to his genuine handwriting samples, the pressure and rhythm of the pen strokes inconsistent with authentic script, several letter forms constructed in ways that suggested careful, deliberate imitation rather than natural writing. Forgery, the expert concluded plainly. Skilled forgery, but forgery nonetheless. Elena read the letter 3 times before the reality of it fully settled into her chest, relief so overwhelming it nearly buckled her knees. Her father's name, finally, could be cleared beyond reasonable doubt. She sent word to Nathaniel immediately, and within hours, his carriage arrived at her door once more, his expression tense with anticipation, as she handed him the expert's written conclusion. "This is precisely what we needed," he said, reading through the document with visible relief evident in the loosening of his shoulders. "Combined with the financial records Mrs. Whitfield has helped us assemble connecting my aunt to the fictional shipping venture, I believe we finally have sufficient evidence to confront her directly." "What happens then?" Elena asked, uncertainty creeping back into her voice despite the vindication she had just received. "She is still your family, Your Grace. Exposing her publicly will bring considerable scandal upon your own household, regardless of how deserved that scandal might be." Nathaniel's jaw tightened with grim resolve. "My family's reputation has already suffered considerably more from her theft and manipulation than it ever would from honest reckoning with the truth. I have spent weeks agonizing over how to proceed without destroying what remains of my family's standing entirely, but I have come to understand that protecting a thief simply because she shares my blood serves no one, least of all the truth your father deserves restored to his memory." They decided, after careful discussion, that the confrontation should occur privately first, giving Lady Margaret opportunity to explain herself before any public exposure became necessary, though both of them harbored little genuine hope that any explanation she offered would prove satisfactory given the overwhelming evidence now assembled against her. The confrontation was arranged for the following evening, in the same private study where Elena had first learned of her father's forgiven debt, where later she had watched that same forgiveness threatened by carefully fabricated lies. This time, Elena insisted on being present herself, unwilling to remain excluded from a conversation so directly concerning her father's stolen reputation, and Nathaniel, after brief hesitation, agreed to her presence. Lady Margaret arrived at the appointed hour with her usual composed grace, though something flickered briefly across her expression upon seeing Elena already seated near the window, some fleeting recognition that this gathering carried different weight than she had perhaps anticipated. "Nathaniel," she greeted smoothly, settling into a chair across from her nephew's desk. "You mentioned urgent matters requiring my attention this evening. I confess I am curious what could not wait until morning." "The truth, Aunt Margaret," Nathaniel replied evenly, though Elena could hear the tightly controlled anger threading beneath his measured words. "Specifically, the truth regarding the fictional shipping venture you have used for years to disguise substantial sums stolen from this estate's finances." Lady Margaret's composure did not immediately crack, though something sharpened behind her eyes, calculation replacing surprise with impressive speed. "I do not know what you mean, Nathaniel. Whatever accusations Miss Hartley has whispered in your ear, I would remind you that desperate people often invent convenient stories to protect their own interests." "These are not Miss Hartley's inventions," Nathaniel said, sliding a folder across his desk containing the assembled evidence, financial records, correspondence with the London merchant, and the handwriting expert's damning conclusion regarding the forged letters. "These are independently verified facts, Aunt Margaret. I would suggest you review them carefully before offering further denial." For the first time since Elena had known her, Lady Margaret's carefully maintained composure faltered visibly as she scanned the documents, her hands, previously so steady and elegant, beginning to tremble almost imperceptibly against the papers. When she finally looked up, the polished pretense had entirely dissolved, replaced by something raw and desperate that Elena had not expected to witness from a woman she had only ever seen wielding cold, calculated cruelty. "You do not understand what it was like," Lady Margaret said, her voice suddenly stripped of its earlier sweetness, revealing something bitter and long buried beneath decades of practiced grace. "Your father inherited everything, Nathaniel, the title, the estate, the fortune, simply through the accident of his birth as the eldest son, while I was married off to a man who squandered what little I brought into our union within a decade, leaving me with nothing but the charity of relatives who never let me forget my dependence on their generosity." That does not justify theft, Nathaniel said, though something in his voice softened slightly despite his obvious anger. Some old, complicated family loyalty still tangled beneath his fury. Nor does it justify destroying an innocent man's memory to protect yourself. I never intended for Miss Hartley's father to suffer any consequence beyond the debt he genuinely owed, Lady Margaret said, though the excuse rang hollow even as she offered it. The forged letters were meant only as insurance, a contingency should anyone begin questioning the estate's finances too closely. I did not anticipate that you would develop such particular interest in his daughter, Nathaniel, nor that your interest would eventually threaten to expose everything I have carefully built to secure my own independence after years of enforced dependence on others' charity. Elena listened to this confession with complicated, tangled emotion, understanding, even as anger continued burning beneath her ribs, something of the genuine desperation that had apparently driven Lady Margaret toward such calculated cruelty. It did not excuse what she had done, the willingness to destroy a dead man's reputation and threaten a living woman's future simply to protect her own comfort. But it painted a more complicated portrait than the simple villainy Elena had assumed motivated her earlier scheming. What happens now? Lady Margaret asked finally, her earlier composure entirely abandoned, replaced by something closer to genuine fear as she faced her nephew across the desk. Will you have me arrested, Nathaniel? Dragged through public scandal that will destroy whatever remains of this family's reputation alongside my own? Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing difficult choices with no clean, satisfying resolution available to him. I have not yet decided the full consequence you must face, Aunt Margaret. But you will return every stolen shilling to this estate's accounts, and you will sign a full confession clearing Mr. Hartley's name publicly and completely. Beyond that, I will consider what mercy, if any, your genuine remorse might warrant, though I confess I have seen precious little remorse in your explanation thus far, only justification. Lady Margaret's composure crumbled further at this, tears finally breaking through the careful mask she had maintained throughout the confrontation, though Elena could not determine whether they sprang from genuine regret or simply from the collapse of schemes she had maintained successfully for so many years. The confrontation continued for some time longer, details of repayment and confession negotiated with careful, exhausting precision, until finally Lady Margaret departed the study alone, her earlier elegant confidence replaced by something diminished and uncertain. Once she had gone, Nathaniel sank into the chair behind his desk, exhaustion evident in every line of his posture, the weight of confronting his own family's corruption finally settling fully upon him now that the confrontation itself had concluded. Elena crossed the room and, without fully considering the propriety of the gesture, placed her hand gently upon his shoulder. You did what was right, she said quietly, even though it clearly cost you a great deal to do it. Nathaniel looked up at her, something raw and grateful visible in his tired eyes. It cost far less than continuing to protect a lie would have cost me, Miss Hartley. I understand that now, largely because you refused to allow me the comfortable ignorance I might otherwise have chosen. Thank you, for your courage in pursuing truth even when doing so placed you in considerable danger. Your father's memory is nearly cleared, Elena replied, though something warmer than simple relief colored her voice as she spoke. That alone was worth every risk I took to see it accomplished. They remained together in the quiet study for a while longer, the events of the evening settling slowly around them, the fragile trust that had grown steadily between them these past weeks finally solidifying into something neither of them seemed inclined to question too closely. Not tonight, with exhaustion and vindication both still fresh and raw between them. News of Lady Margaret's confession spread through society with the same swift, hungry speed that had once carried false rumors about Elena's virtue, though this time the story that traveled from drawing room to drawing room told an entirely different tale, one of a wronged merchant's daughter finally vindicated, a corrupt aristocrat exposed, and a duke brave enough to sacrifice his own family's comfort in pursuit of honest truth. Elena found herself, within the span of a single week, transformed once again in the eyes of society, this time from scandal's target into something closer to quiet admiration. Julian called upon her twice during that week, his warmth and attention unchanged despite the dramatic shift in circumstances surrounding her, and Elena found herself increasingly troubled by the growing awareness that whatever comfortable affection had developed between them, it did not carry the same charged, undeniable intensity that colored every interaction with Nathaniel, however complicated and uncertain that connection remained. She confided this confusion to Charlotte one evening, the two of them sharing tea in Elena's small parlor while Thomas practiced his letters quietly in the corner, no longer flinching at the sound of every passing carriage now that the family's financial troubles had been fully resolved. You care for them both, Charlotte observed, not unkindly, studying her friend's troubled expression with careful patience. That is not a crime, Elena, though I understand it feels like an impossible tangle to unravel. Julian offers safety, Elena said slowly, working through her own tangled feelings aloud. Comfortable, uncomplicated safety. Exactly what circumstances have taught me to value above nearly everything else these past difficult years. But Nathaniel offers something else entirely, something I do not fully have words for, something that frightens me precisely because it feels so much larger and more consuming than simple comfort. Perhaps, Charlotte suggested gently, the question is not which man offers the safer choice, but which connection feels true when you strip away every practical consideration of debt and reputation and survival. You have spent so long simply surviving, Elena. Perhaps it is time you allowed yourself to consider what you actually want, rather than merely what circumstances seem to demand. Elena turned this over carefully in the days that followed, watching her own heart with unfamiliar honesty as she navigated continued invitations from both men, Julian's steady warmth and Nathaniel's complicated intensity pulling at her, in ways that grew increasingly difficult to ignore, or postpone resolving indefinitely. The matter came to a head at a grand ball hosted by the Ashworth estate 3 weeks later, the first major social gathering Nathaniel had hosted since Lady Margaret's public confession and quiet departure from society to live under considerably reduced circumstances at a distant relative's country home. The ballroom, the very same room where Elena had once been forced to dance beneath mocking candlelight, now glittered with an entirely different atmosphere, anticipation and curiosity replacing the cruel hunger that had once filled it. Elena arrived in a new gown, a gift from Nathaniel that she had initially resisted accepting before Charlotte convinced her that refusing such a gesture, offered with genuine respect rather than condescension, would serve no one well. The deep blue silk caught the candlelight beautifully as she moved through the crowd, and she felt, for the first time since that terrible night months earlier, genuinely comfortable within these grand walls rather than merely enduring them. Julian found her early in the evening, his expression warm as always, though something more serious colored his greeting this time. "Miss Hartley, might I request a private word before the dancing begins?" She followed him to a quiet alcove near the tall windows, the same windows where she had once composed herself after her forced performance, and found herself unable to shake the sense that this conversation would prove significant regardless of which direction it ultimately took. "I have watched you carefully these past weeks," Julian began, his usual easy confidence tempered by evident nervousness, "and I believe I have come to understand something I perhaps should have recognized sooner. Your heart, Miss Hartley, however much genuine affection you hold for me, does not belong fully to me. I believe it belongs, whether you have fully admitted this to yourself or not, to Ashworth." Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks, caught between honest confirmation and the desire to spare his feelings through gentle denial. "Lord Reeve, I hold you in genuine deep regard. What has grown between us these past weeks has been real, whatever else may also be true." "I do not doubt that," Julian said, offering her a smile that held more genuine warmth than bitterness. "Remarkable generosity given the circumstances. And I will treasure the friendship we have built regardless of what path you ultimately choose. But I would rather release you honestly now than watch you spend a lifetime wondering what might have been, had you chosen differently. You deserve to choose freely, Miss Hartley, without obligation clouding your judgment, simply because I was kind to you when kindness felt scarce." Elena's eyes filled with unexpected tears at his generous honesty, gratitude and relief tangling together, with something bittersweet at the genuine loss of what might have grown between them under different circumstances. "You are a remarkable man, Lord Reeve. Whoever eventually earns your full devotion will be fortunate beyond measure." "Perhaps," Julian said, offering a final warm smile, before straightening and glancing toward the ballroom where music had just begun. "Go find him, Miss Hartley. I believe he has been watching this alcove with considerable anxiety since the moment we disappeared into it." Elena laughed, despite the emotion still tight in her throat, and returned to the ballroom, immediately locating Nathaniel standing near the edge of the dance floor, his gaze fixed on the alcove she had just emerged from, with exactly the anxious intensity Julian had predicted. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and something wordless passed between them, an understanding that needed no further explanation. He crossed the room to meet her, ignoring the curious glances of gathered guests who had clearly noticed the charged tension building between the Duke and the merchant's daughter whose name had become inseparable from his own these past difficult months. "Miss Hartley," he said, offering a formal bow that could not quite disguise the eagerness beneath his composed exterior, "might I request the honor of this dance?" Elena glanced toward the musicians, recognizing with a jolt of memory the same waltz that had once been used as an instrument of her humiliation, now poised to become something else entirely, under vastly different circumstances. You may, Your Grace, though I confess this particular music carries complicated memory for me. Then let us create a new memory to replace it, Nathaniel said quietly, extending his hand toward her with unmistakable sincerity, one built on genuine partnership rather than cruel command. Elena placed her hand in his, and as the music began, they moved together onto the dance floor, the entire ballroom watching with rapt attention, as the same waltz that had once forced her into humiliating spectacle now carried her instead into something that looked, unmistakably, like joy, freely chosen, rather than pain forcibly extracted. I owe you an apology I have not yet properly offered, Nathaniel said quietly as they moved through the familiar steps, his hand steady at her waist, his eyes never leaving her face. For that first terrible night, for my hesitation in the study when my aunt's lies threatened your father's memory, for every moment I allowed doubt or family loyalty to overshadow what I owed you in honesty and courage. You have spent these past months proving your remorse through action rather than empty words, Your Grace, Elena replied, allowing herself, finally, to relax fully into the dance, into the warmth of his hand at her waist, into the certainty that had been building steadily beneath her wariness for weeks now. That has meant considerably more to me than any apology could accomplish alone. Nathaniel, he corrected gently, please, if we are to continue whatever this has become between us, I would very much prefer you use my given name. Elena smiled, something warm and unguarded blooming fully across her features for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. Nathaniel, she repeated softly, testing the intimacy of the name on her tongue. Very well. They continued dancing as the entire ballroom watched, guests who had once gathered to witness her humiliation, now witnessing instead something considerably more moving, a genuine connection forged through hardship and honesty, rather than cruelty and command. When the final notes of the waltz faded, Nathaniel did not release her hand immediately, instead drawing her slightly closer, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear his next words. I love you, Elena, he said simply, without pretense or careful calculation, the words carrying the same raw honesty he had shown her in his study weeks earlier, when he first admitted difficulty thinking of anything else since the night she danced. I have known it for some time now, though I lacked the courage to speak it plainly until I had proven myself worthy of saying it at all. Elena felt her heart swell with something too large for careful, measured words, gratitude and joy and certainty all tangling together into overwhelming feeling. I love you as well, Nathaniel, despite every reason circumstance gave me to guard against it, despite every fear that first terrible night planted deep within me. I love you. Around them, the ballroom erupted into applause once more. Guests who had witnessed the tender exchange, even without hearing the whispered words themselves, understanding perfectly what had just transpired between the Duke and the woman whose grace had once turned public cruelty into public wonder. The sound of it filled the grand hall exactly as it had months earlier, though this time, no shadow of humiliation colored its meaning, only genuine, unguarded celebration of something hard-won and deeply deserved. Later that evening, once the majority of guests had departed and only a few close friends remained gathered near the refreshment tables, Nathaniel led Elena out onto the terrace overlooking the same gardens where, months earlier, she had first begun to understand that whatever existed between them defied simple categorization as cruelty or debt or obligation. The night air was cool and clear, stars scattered brilliantly across the dark sky above them, and for a while, neither of them spoke, content simply to stand together in comfortable silence after the emotional intensity of the evening's revelations. Thomas will need proper schooling, Elena said eventually, her mind turning practically toward the future even as her heart remained full of the evening's tender declarations. I have managed to save what little I could these past months, but a proper education requires resources beyond what I currently possess. That is easily remedied, Nathaniel replied, drawing her closer against the cool evening air, assuming, of course, that you would permit me the honor of ensuring your brother receives every opportunity his considerable intelligence deserves. Elena turned to face him fully, searching his expression in the moonlight. You speak as though you intend for our futures to remain connected well beyond this single evening's tender words, Your Grace. I do, Nathaniel confirmed, something serious and determined replacing the earlier softness in his gaze. Elena Hartley, I have watched you transform humiliation into grace, grief into determination, and uncertainty into unwavering courage these past months. I do not wish to simply court you through careful, proper stages toward some eventual, distant proposal. I wish to ask you now, plainly, whether you would consider becoming my wife." The question hung in the cool night air between them, and Elena felt her breath catch, overwhelmed by the swift, decisive honesty of his request, so different from the careful, calculated cruelty that had once defined their earliest interactions in this very garden's shadow. She thought of everything that had led them to this moment, the terrible night of forced performance, the cancelled debt, the rumors and forgeries and dangerous investigation, the slow, difficult building of trust between two people who had every reason to remain enemies, and instead found something far more precious growing steadily between them. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the overwhelming emotion swelling within her chest. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will marry you." He kissed her then, gently, beneath the scattered stars, and Elena felt every remaining fragment of fear and uncertainty that had haunted her since that terrible first night finally dissolve completely, replaced by something warm and certain, and entirely her own to claim. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Nathaniel rested his forehead gently against hers, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth that she had rarely seen him wear so openly. "I intend to spend considerable effort ensuring you never again have reason to doubt my devotion," he murmured. "Though I suspect it will take years of careful demonstration before I have fully earned forgiveness for how cruelly this began." "You have already earned considerably more forgiveness than you perhaps credit yourself with," Elena replied softly, reaching up to touch his cheek with unguarded tenderness. "Though I will not object to years of continued demonstration, if that is what you wish to offer." They remained on the terrace a while longer, making tentative plans for a future that felt, for the first time and longer than Elena could easily remember, genuinely secure and full of possibility, rather than merely survivable. When they finally returned inside to share their news with the small gathering of close friends still remaining, Charlotte's joyful tears and Agnes's warm, knowing smile confirmed what both women had clearly suspected building between Elena and Nathaniel for weeks now, long before either of them had found courage enough to speak it plainly. The wedding, when it finally occurred some months later, was a considerably smaller affair than the grand society spectacle many had expected from a duke's marriage, held instead in the small village church near Elena's childhood home, attended by close friends and family, rather than the wide circle of society acquaintances who had once gathered eagerly to witness her humiliation. Thomas, dressed proudly in his finest new clothes, walked his sister down the aisle in place of their deceased father, tears of genuine joy standing in his young eyes as he watched Elena become, officially and permanently, part of a family that had once threatened to destroy everything she held dear, and instead had become the foundation of everything she now treasured most. As Elena and Nathaniel exchanged their vows before the small gathering, sunlight streaming through the church's simple windows, she found herself thinking, briefly, of her mother, of the graceful lessons taught in secret during their family's darkest hours, of the quiet promise that grace was the one thing poverty could never fully steal. She understood now, standing beside the man who had once forced her into public humiliation and eventually transformed that terrible beginning into the foundation of genuine love, that her mother had been entirely correct. Grace, once truly claimed, could not be stolen by cruelty, could not be diminished by rumor or scandal, could only grow stronger through every hardship it survived, and eventually transformed into something beautiful. A year passed swiftly after the wedding, filled with the quiet, steady happiness that Elena had once believed impossible for a woman in her circumstances to ever claim. Ashworth Manor, once a place of cold formality and hidden corruption, gradually transformed under her presence into something warmer, its halls filled increasingly with laughter rather than careful, guarded silence. Thomas thrived under the tutors Nathaniel arranged for him, his early fear finally replaced by genuine curiosity and confidence, as he grew into the kind of steady, thoughtful young man their father would have been proud to recognize. Lady Margaret, true to the terms of her confession, had repaid every stolen shilling over the course of that year, funds slowly restoring the estate's finances to full health, while she lived quietly under her distant relative's roof, her letters to Nathaniel occasional and carefully humble, seeking gradual reconciliation rather than demanding immediate forgiveness. Elena, surprising even herself, found room in her heart to extend cautious grace toward the woman who had once tried to destroy her father's memory, understanding that genuine change, however slow and imperfect, deserved acknowledgement rather than permanent condemnation. Julian Reeve remained a close and valued friend throughout that year, his easy warmth never diminished by the path Elena had ultimately chosen, his own heart eventually finding genuine attachment with a thoughtful young woman he met at a mutual friends gathering the following spring. Elena attended his wedding with genuine joy, grateful that the man who had shown her such generous kindness during her most difficult season had found happiness of his own, unburdened by any lingering complication from their earlier, gentler connection. Agnes Whitfield remained a beloved fixture within Ashworth Manor, her position elevated with Nathaniel's genuine gratitude for her loyalty and courage during the difficult months of investigation that had ultimately cleared Elena's father's name. She often spoke fondly of Elena's mother during quiet afternoon conversations, sharing fragments of memory that helped Elena understand more fully the graceful, resilient woman who had shaped her earliest years before hardship claimed their family's fortune. Elena herself found unexpected purpose beyond her role as Duchess, establishing a small school within the village bordering the estate, where children, regardless of their family's financial circumstances, could receive proper education, much as she wished had been available to her own family during their hardest years. She taught dance there herself on occasion, passing along the graceful lessons her mother had once taught her in secret, watching young girls discover the same quiet strength and confidence that had once carried her through the most humiliating night of her life and transformed it, against every expectation, into the beginning of genuine happiness. Nathaniel proved himself, month after month, exactly the steady, honest partner he had promised to become that night on the terrace beneath scattered stars. He governed his estate with newfound integrity, personally reviewing every ledger and account to ensure the corruption that had once flourished under his father's neglect and his aunt's manipulation could never again take root within his household. He spoke often, in quiet moments shared only with Elena, of his gratitude that fate had brought them together through such difficult circumstances, transforming what began as cruelty into partnership built on genuine mutual respect and hard-won trust. Their first child, a daughter, arrived just before their second wedding anniversary, and Nathaniel insisted, over Elena's gentle protest, that the choice belonged equally to them both, that she be named after Elena's mother, honoring the graceful woman whose lessons had ultimately shaped the course of both their lives, even though she had not lived to witness how profoundly her memory would eventually influence her daughter's extraordinary future. Standing in the nursery one quiet evening, watching Nathaniel hold their infant daughter with the same careful tenderness he now brought to every aspect of their shared life together, Elena allowed herself to fully reflect on the improbable journey that had led them to this moment. She thought of the terrified young woman dragged before 200 mocking guests, forced into humiliation by a man who believed cruelty was the only language power understood. She thought of the desperate weeks that followed, the forged letters and dangerous investigation, the fragile trust built slowly through shared purpose and hard-earned honesty. She thought, most of all, of the moment the entire ballroom had risen to their feet, transforming what should have been her darkest humiliation into the unexpected beginning of everything she now held most precious. Grace, her mother had always insisted, could not be stolen by those who sought to diminish others through cruelty. It could only be claimed, fully and completely, by those brave enough to carry themselves with dignity, even when the world around them offered every reason to abandon it entirely. Elena crossed the nursery and settled beside her husband, resting her head against his shoulder as their daughter slept peacefully in his arms, and understood, with quiet, settled certainty, that whatever difficult path had brought her to this moment, she would not have chosen any different beginning, however painful, if it meant arriving at this same, deeply cherished end. The ballroom that had once witnessed her deepest humiliation now stood, within the story their family would tell for generations to come, as the place where everything truly worth having in her life had first, improbably, begun.